Hello, and welcome to episode 55 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Helen Longino, the Clarence Irving Lewis Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University. Helen migrated from undergraduate literary studies to graduate study in logic and philosophy of language, and thence to philosophy of science and theory of knowledge. Active in anti-war and women's liberation movements in the late 1960s and 1970s, she also helped to establish and or stabilize women's studies programs at several of the institutions at which she has taught. As chair of the American Philosophical Association's Committee on the Status of Women in the Profession, she helped draw attention to continuing subtle forms of discrimination against women. In addition to her work in philosophy of science, Helen has published on social issues such as education, competition, and pornography. Philosophically, Helen is an advocate of a strong form of social epistemology that she calls critical contextual empiricism. She has developed facets of her view in essays in philosophy of science and feminist philosophy journals and anthologies, as well as in her books, Science is Social Knowledge, The Fate of Knowledge, and her most recent work, Studying Human Behavior, How Scientists Investigate Aggression and Sexuality. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Helen. Dr. Helen Longino, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Tuesday afternoon?
I'm pretty well.
Good to hear.
Rainy California.
Rainy California. Yeah, so I take it you are currently at Stanford University, is that right?
That's correct.
That's great. How is the beginning of the term getting along?
Well, I met my first class this morning, so
very nice.
You have to ask them.
What do you?
It's kind of fun.
Fun. What are you teaching this term?
I'm teaching a course called Feminist and Queer Theories and Methods Across the Disciplines.
Have you taught it before?
Oh, yes. I've taught it every year that I've been teaching here at Stanford, and versions of it before. It's a multidisciplinary class intended to help students who want to incorporate feminist and or queer perspectives in their research to do so, to give them the tools to do that.
Fascinating. What kind of students typically take this class? Is it philosophers? Is it other social scientists?
It varies a lot from year to year. Last year I had a concentration of philosophers in the class, which was very unusual. This year they seem to be all over the place. The graduate students range from students in theater and performance studies to students in environment and resources. The undergrads some of them are philosophy majors, some of them are feminist, gender, and sexuality studies majors, some of them are historians, some of them are in some kind of natural science. So they're all over the place.
What was the impetus for you for deciding to design and offer this course?
I first offered something like this course at University of Minnesota, where I taught a core course for PhD students in feminist studies. And when I came to Stanford, there was a course called Theories and Methods Across the Disciplines, Feminist Theories and Methods Across the Disciplines. And I was expected to teach at least one course for the feminist studies program, and that seemed the obvious one for a philosopher of science to take up. So that's it, and I've modified it over the years that I've taught it. So it's a kind of living, breathing entity, and I really enjoy it. I get a different kind of configuration of students every time, and that makes it always a very kind of new experience for me.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing just maybe how you've seen the course change over time.
Basically, by incorporating more recent material. So, I've incorporated certainly more queer material in over the years. More material on transgender identities, for example. More post-colonial critiques of what you might call second wave feminist approaches. So I try to kind of introduce students to the basics and then to the ways in which they've been challenged and responded to challenge over the decades.
Okay. Very nice, very nice. Well, I wish you the best of luck in this particular class, and hope the students like it as well.
I do too.
Are there any other, plans for the spring? Teaching a class, projects you're working on?
I won't be teaching in the spring. We're on the quarter.
Oh, that's right. Okay. This is the winter quarter, or
and that's the only formal course I'm teaching. I've got a lot of independent studies or graduate student thesis work that I'll be supervising this quarter. Next quarter, I'll be doing more of that. No classroom teaching, though. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we can return to some of the current work and the projects and perhaps PhD supervisions of what you're doing. But before we do that, why don't we take a step back? I'm sure a lot of our listeners are interested to find out, someone like yourself, a very well-known philosopher of science, where did they get their start? So tell us, Helen, where did you grow up?
I grew up all over the place, actually. Mm-hmm. My father was in the Navy, so we moved quite frequently. In fact, my first move took place when I was 6 weeks old.
Wow.
My parents transplanted across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast. And you might say I've been on the move ever since.
Was it moving along with Dad, basically, in terms of naval stationing and whatnot?
Right. That's right. Mostly on the East Coast and in Europe.
Really? Where in Europe?
In Paris and Naples. Those are the two places that we spent the longest periods of time while I was still living with them.
Wow. And so was this from about what age to what age were you kind of moving about?
Well, from 6 weeks to whenever I went off to college.
Okay.
My father was still on active duty until I was in graduate school.
Sure. So I guess, could I say, what was it like, being from all over the place?
Well, I kind of liked it. Some people hate it.
Sure.
But we were lucky enough to live in really great places. We ended up spending 5 years in New York City near Columbia University. And then, of course, there were the times in Paris and Naples, which I absolutely loved. So we had a really great experience. Not everybody who grows up this way does. If you're just going from military base to military base, that can be pretty dismal. But
sure.
That wasn't our experience. We didn't live on bases. So.
Wow. No, that sounds fascinating.
And our parents sent us to local schools. So we didn't go to American schools in wherever. We went to the French schools or Italian schools.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a favorite maybe place growing up where you lived?
Well, the place that I kind of kept in my mind's eye as my place was a place that I saw was, well, I guess, the Mediterranean coast, I'd have to say.
What was so nice about that?
It's hard to say what was so nice about it. It was beautiful. You could see if you were offshore, you could see past the shoreline off to the mountains. So there was a kind of variegated landscape. from the sea. The seashore itself was really beautiful. It's really hard to say, but it's why when I finally came to California as an adult, I decided this was where I was going to stay.
Sure, miss the sea. Yeah, I can understand. Yeah, I bet I could see that. So moving around and throughout your youth, what kinds of interests did you develop? What kinds of things were you interested in, getting excited about?
Well, I was a great reader. I did all kinds of reading when I was a kid. Like anybody else, I like to play out. Well, I guess most people like to play outside. I like to play outside. I don't know that I developed any particular intellectual interests, although I do know that when I was in 8th grade, I wrote a paper about women in physics. So,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, tell us about this. What?
Well, I have no idea what I said.
Oh, you just remember that was a
research. I did some research and found out about women who had distinguished themselves in physics, and I think that's sort of precursor to the interest I had in the sciences. Although I did not pursue the sciences as an undergraduate, I ended up studying literature instead.
Yeah, so a love of deep reading, which I took you to Barnard College. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. What made you decide to study English literature?
Well, I cycled through the introductory courses for a number of different majors, and I, what I really wanted was something that I felt was broad, would enable me to engage with a lot of different aspects of human life, and I thought I found that in literature, and to some extent that's true. In my senior year, though I took a couple of courses in philosophy, but in my senior year I took a course in aesthetics, which really turned me on to using my mind in the way philosophers use our minds. That is, really thinking through problems and just kind of coming to solutions through analytical thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I switched.
And at this time, what career ideas, insights? Did you have any particular ambitions?
No. I had no idea. I mean, I thought I was going to be a writer, of some kind, but I didn't have really a concept of career. I don't know why. I think probably I was set out to be some kind of what we would have called them a bohemian. I thought I'd somehow find a way to make a living. I had worked through. After my freshman year through college. So it's not that work was unknown to me, but work was just a way to make a living. Sure.
So by bohemian, do you mean it's kind of, being in the arts or in the humanities, but not in a career focused kind of way?
Exactly.
More of in a doing, I'll do what I love, I do what I'm passionate about, I'll make enough to survive or to live, but really my passions will be in like things like writing or music or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. That was my attitude.
Okay. All right. So, and then you came across a course in aesthetics.
Course in aesthetics?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was the kind of really disciplined and kind of logically grounded use of the mind that really turned me on. The professor for that class invited us, some of us who I always spent the summer in New York after my first year in college. So I was doing that even after I finished, and so some of us who'd been taking various courses were invited to participate in a summer seminar during which we read Anscombe's Intention. And and that kind of close reading of a philosophical text, again, was really, really exciting to me. I read most of the essays in Quine's A Logical Point of View, or From a Logical Point of View, and I was just, that was it for me. And I have to say, I had read a certain amount of existentialist philosophy as a kid in high school.
Yeah.
That was, it was interesting. I clearly had some attraction to abstract thought, but what I found in analytic philosophy was just mind-blowing for me. So I pursued a master's degree in philosophy in the UK with a concentration in logic and epistemology, and then did a PhD in the US at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore.
I see. So what brought about the transition from, it seems like having some broad interest, or perhaps in logic, and at University of Sussex, I'm seeing here, to transitioning to philosophy of science? Well,
it's a kind of embarrassing story.
Sure, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, what did it was when I was really interested in issues having to do with language, and I read a paper with two authors, and I don't even remember very much exactly what the paper was about, but I thought it was really good. It was some kind of response to Goodman's GRU problem, and the authors invoked the idea of context and the importance of context in determining something or other. Anyway, I thought it was a really smart paper, and so I thought I'd like to study with them. They happened to be teaching at Johns Hopkins, and when I got there, I found out that one of them, Stephen Barker, was a philosopher of math, and the other, Peter Achenstein, was a philosopher of physics. So,
there you
go. If I learn anything from these guys, that's what I had to do.
Yeah. And can you recall, I suppose, anything that was in particular that you learned, or the kind of the way of thinking that studying with those fellows, studying philosophy of science, brought to your tool set?
Well, I think it is something about context. Although I'd be hard put to tell you exactly what it was that I got from them. But I think that because context has been treated much more extensively since they were writing about it by other philosophers. So it's not as though they were pioneering, but in their teaching, I thought that they were very sensitive to contextual factors, and I think that something about the way that they taught and about the way that they wrote made me pay attention to contextual factors. So I think that's really what I got from them. One might say oddly, given that they were kind of very much working in the analytical mode.
Yeah. So how did you combine and synthesize, working in an analytic mode and bringing in these contextual factors?
Well, I think that's one thing that philosophy of science, ending up in philosophy of science did for me, because I went and did a bunch of history of science so that I, would know something, and that gave me a kind of sensitivity to history, for example.
Was this while at Johns Hopkins?
This is while at Hopkins. Yeah,
oh.
yeah. And also, I think, philosophers of science, there are different ways of doing philosophy of science. One can do philosophy of science as a really, really abstract pursuit, or one can pay attention to actual science. And both Barker and Ashenstein paid attention to actual mathematics in the one case, or to actual physics, since when I was a graduate student, that's what science was, actual physics in Ashenstein's case. So I think, so as I think about it now in relation to your question, I think that something else I got from them was attention to both science and mathematics as practices, not just as kind of bodies of propositions or bodies of equations, but as activities that humans engage in. And that's very much always kind of informed my conception of science. And my interest in science is an interest in how humans make sense of their world, our world, I should say.
Yeah. So I see your dissertation topic titled Inference and Scientific Discovery. Does this is this sort of the beginning of addressing that particular question?
Yes. I mean, the dissertation itself was kind of narrow, but yes, it was. I mean, what I was interested in was, back then it was very conventional to adopt Popper's distinction between discovery and justification. It's a distinction that lots of people were making, where activities of discovery were of no interest philosophically as compared with activities of justification, which were amenable to logical analysis. And I wanted to argue, and I did argue in the dissertation, that discovery wasn't just a matter of having a dream or having a sudden insight, but that there are many cases in which scientists reasoned their way to an answer to some problem. So that was, yeah.
All right. And so working with this and then graduating, what came next in your career in terms of, I imagine, were you looking for jobs in philosophy, interested in other work? What were you up to?
Well, while I was a graduate student, of course, I was always on the verge of dropping out to political work. So
tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was very much involved in the anti-war movements at the time, and that kind of activity seemed very pressing.
So this was in the early 70s, is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is right at the time.
Yeah, and that actually continued even into my first job. And actually, I mean, I remained a political person, probably not in the same ways that I was in my younger days, but I'm certainly politically engaged.
So when you say, sure. So when you say politically engaged, would you mind, yes. So as you're a student, what kinds of activities, groups, things, what exactly are you getting involved in? What are you doing in these early 70s times, in these very active times?
When I was a student, I was involved in getting other students engaged in protest activities. I distributed information about the draft and things that one might do about the draft. Eventually, I was working in Gene McCarthy's presidential campaign. He was, but I actually got disillusioned with some of my fellow workers, so I didn't continue in that.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yes. But this was the period still when women were expected to be subordinate in any kind of political activity. So eventually, I found my way to the women's movement, where women were not expected to be subordinates. That was actually after I moved into my first job.
Yeah. So I see I would actually love to hear a little bit about that. And perhaps, I guess we could discuss it now. So I know much of your work has been was being active in the women's liberation movement in establishing women's studies in several institutions. Is this in and around that time, or is that a little bit later?
That's actually later.
Okay.
But it's continuous in the sense that...
Sure.
Well, let's see. Okay, so I finished graduate school. 4 years and you're out, and
wow.
I was very fortunate to get a job. This was through one of my professors at Hopkins, for whom I'd taken some courses from him and TA'd for him. Told a colleague of his at UCSD that he thought they should interview me for a job that they were likely to have.
Very nice.
This is well before jobs were advertised fully, and the way anybody found out about jobs was that people in departments that were going to be hiring would write to people at institutions that they knew and ask them if they had any students coming up.
Oh.
So, yeah, it was.
There was not these big. There wasn't fill jobs in these.
There was not fill jobs. No. There was the Eastern APA. However, the meat market.
Right. So I've heard.
So anyway, that was great. I took the job at University of California, San Diego, and I was there for 4 years. I found my way to the local Women's Liberation Front group very quickly after I got there. We did various kinds of studies. We did various interventions. For example, an all-male panel discussing abortion. Kind of
fun
there.
Wow.
We organized protests against the U.S. military engagement in Southeast Asia. And something else that this group did was to organize the first course. This was a student-initiated course on women. So it was the first women's studies course at UC San Diego. They asked me to teach something having to do with science. Mm-hmm. And so I did some reading around, found some material to talk about, and that's what got me started thinking about feminist issues in relation to the sciences, and obviously got me engaged in women's studies altogether.
So, what did women's studies look like in the mid-'70s, late '70s?
It looked like isolated courses here and there, in many cases student-initiated. And interesting, I mean, it very quickly blossomed from these kinds of initial student-initiated courses to more extensive programs as faculty at institutions across the country themselves were personally touched one way or another by the women's movement and took it upon themselves to figure out ways to bring their disciplines and disciplinary training to bear on a new body of issues. So you had the development of women's history, you had the development of feminist literary studies, sociology, psychology. All of these started kind of whole new areas, opened up whole new areas of thinking. And, they, I think, quickly transformed from thinking about individuals as gendered to thinking more about the way in which gender structures social relations and so forth. So I think it was a kind of mushrooming intellectual enterprise. And now, of course, there are several institutions that offer PhDs in feminist studies, majors in feminist studies or women's studies all over the place. We at Stanford have a major. We don't have a department, but we do have a program. We also have a PhD minor in feminist studies. So
wonderful. So in developing these early in the mid and late 70s, were they well received? Did you meet any resistance in attempting?
Oh, lots of resistance.
Tell me a little. Tell me a little bit about that. What kinds of challenges did you have to face?
Well, there's institutional inertia, among other things. Certainly, the students who took women's studies courses had to face the skepticism, to put it mildly, of their fellow students. So, I think that there was a sense of being pioneers in some way, which was right, and that gave everybody involved a certain kind of strength and kind of spirit for the activity. But feminist scholars had a real struggle getting their work recognized as legitimate scholarship. They had a hard time getting published in conventional journals, and I think in many cases that's still true. And when they did establish their own journals, those were treated as less kind of prestigious venues for publication than the more established mainstream journals. So, and I'll just give you a remark that was passed on to me,
sure.
Which I think typifies this. This is when I was somewhat further along in my career, and I'd applied for a job at Davis, I guess, UC Davis, and apparently one of the faculty members, in response to my application, said, it's really too bad about Longino. She used to be a good philosopher, but now she's gone over to women's studies.
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of attitude that many women had to face.
Oh, that's ridiculous. Yeah, it's incredible.
So what's wonderful is that there are certainly people who think that way these days, but there are many fewer, and and I think in many quarters, feminist work in philosophy has been recognized as making important contributions. So, yeah, I think we've come a long way.
Yeah. So this is a perfect time to ask. So in doing and helping to develop these women's studies programs, I imagine some of this work with which you were doing may have impacted your work in how you do philosophy of science. Could you maybe then, describe a little bit about how you've developed, your feminist approaches and feminist studies in doing philosophy of science? Well,
certainly in some of the questions I took up in philosophy of science, I thought, one of the things that happened was I was working on these questions about evidence and the role of background assumptions, and that, of course, worked perfectly with some of the stuff that feminist scientists were saying about some of the conventional research on gender, sex differences, and so forth. The ways in which those were understood, were perceived, the kinds of assumptions that were brought to bear. So the kind of philosophical work that I was doing was I thought really useful for analyzing what was going on there. And I thought that the kind of approach I was developing actually would be helpful for giving a philosophical grounding for what I took feminist scientists to want to be doing, namely, which was both to critique existing science and to develop alternative views, alternative approaches, alternative answers to those that were conventionally accepted. And I think I thought my approach did that better than kind of conventional logical empiricism or than the Kuhnian alternative that seemed to be the only other game in town for many people. I thought I had a different way of approaching these things, and I guess lots of other people seem to think that it was a useful way of approaching those questions.
Yeah. So, and by this, are you referring to your work with this concept of contextual empiricism?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the book that you're well known for: Science's Social Knowledge, Values, and Objectivity in Scientific Inquiry. So,
right.
in this, kind of, what is the main take of this work and what you're getting at?
So the main take is that how many parts does it have? Number one, there is no formal way to exclude the role of values in science, exclude the role of social values in science. There's no formal methodology that can actually accomplish that, which seems to raise a question about objectivity. And the solution, I think, to the question about objectivity that the role of background assumptions raises is to see scientific knowledge as the outcome not just of individual engagement with that part of the world that's under investigation, but also the critical interaction among researchers that enables the questioning of background assumptions that are involved, not just in justificatory reasoning, but also in actually establishing the categories by which we describe and classify the elements in the domain under investigation. So it's, values are ineluctable, but they can be, if you will, managed, or at least their more pernicious effects can be managed through this process of critical interaction undertaken in a community that satisfies certain kinds of norms. So that's the fundamental idea.
Yeah, and those are some pretty big claims. And so, if we were to accept these things, what is the consequence for our conception of science and how we may do science?
One consequence is that when we're trying to understand any given kind of body of scientific work, we want to think about the ways in which, what the relationship between the data and the conclusions that are being put forward as supported by the data are. What we want to ask, what kinds of assumptions are mediating and shaping that relationship, and furthermore, to what extent do those assumptions, some assumptions are going to be empirically confirmable or disconfirmable, but other assumptions are not. Many assumptions carry social values along with them, and so we want to understand the ways in which any given body of inquiry is shaped by the values that are shared by the researchers engaged in the project. And we want to think about the ways in which that work can be critiqued. We want to understand the ways in which the work that results is itself the outcome of kind of critical engagement within a community of researchers. So I think it gives us a different way of thinking about scientific knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as a result of this, what kinds of work came out of this, or in kinds of responses did you receive?
Well, I got different responses. Some initial responses were skeptical responses to my analysis, but I also got positive responses, often from researchers themselves who found that what I was proposing described their work more effectively than other work in philosophy of science that they had read. And of course, I'm not trying to I'm both describing but also engaging in articulating norms. So it's a kind of mixed descriptive normative project that I have. But I think that they found that the kind of account of how science works that grounds the norms that I put forward to make sense to them. So that was very encouraging.
Yeah. And something I think which is particularly important about this is, and I remember learning this in my first graduate seminar in philosophy of science, is this maintenance of a kind of scientific objectivity, resulting regardless of these, or as a part of the values and based on the social structure. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. We're not throwing away objectivity. Objectivity is still really important, but we have a different conception of how objectivity is actually achieved. Yeah.
All right. So this was a very important book. Definitely a book to consider and read if you're a student of philosophy of science, or just interested in one of the better best works in philosophy of science. So in advancing your work, you wrote another book, The Fate of Knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about this book that came later.
Okay. So the A Science of Social Knowledge, the kind of was set in a context where the kind of main contenders were logical empiricism and a kind of Kuhnian holism, where I offered my account as an alternative to both of those. And in The Fate of Knowledge, the kind of intellectual context in which I was writing had become dominated by the so-called science wars.
Right.
Debates between social constructivists and philosophical defenders of the rationality and objectivity of science. And so I tried to take apart the debates that were occurring between constructivists on the one hand and the rational defenders of science. And I made stronger claims about the sociality of scientific knowledge than I had in the first book, arguing that the actual kind of cognitive processes that we bring to the doing of science, observation, reasoning, themselves are importantly social in character. And I also developed a kind of alternative to standard notions of truth as in this concept of conformation, which can capture different kinds of scientific content apart from propositional content. So, and it also captures this notion of kind of degree. Anyway, that's I can't do justice to that idea in a few seconds. But anyway,
sure.
But it's a much more extensive account of the sociality of knowledge, and one that I think actually extends beyond science. I also won't go into that here now either, since I've just made that as a claim in the concluding chapter of that book, The Fate of Knowledge. So basically, it kind of reinforces the fundamental claims I was making in science and social knowledge, but sets them in this new intellectual context, and also introduces much more explicitly than I had in science and social knowledge ideas about pluralism in the sciences. And those ideas got developed in a very particular way in my third book, Studying Human Behavior, where I looked at a variety of scientific approaches that are trying to understand or explain human behavior, and argued that because these approaches essentially carve up the causal landscape in incommensurable ways, they each show us something about the causal determinants of behavior, but none of them can give us the whole picture, and they can't be integrated for kind of technical reasons that I go into in the book, and that leaves us with a really strong kind of scientific pluralism, where
that's
comprehensive understanding only comes about through the availability of and articulation and development of multiple perspectives on a complex phenomenon that resists any kind of unitary account.
Right. So you mentioned that they can't be integrated. What do you mean by integrated in this way?
Well, there are different ways you might integrate. You might integrate by reduction. So you might think, well, there's one fundamental kind of story, maybe a genetic story that everything else can be reduced to. That's one kind of integration. Another kind of integration is actually more eliminative, namely you try to show that all the other approaches are actually false except for one. Or you can try to develop a comprehensive account that takes all of the elements of all these different approaches and constructs a comprehensive theory. So something like developmental systems theory attempts to do that. And what I argue about developmental systems theory is that probably in some metaphysical sense it's correct, but in terms of actually doing practical science, you end up not giving an account of all of the interactions of all of these different phenomena. Generally, researchers concentrate on maybe two and talk about the ways in which they interact. It's just not tractable to do the more complicated. It's just not scientifically or methodologically tractable to do the more complicated thing. And this has to do partly with questions about how you measure and what you measure.
Yeah, this is particularly interesting of my own interest. I'm actually my current research is on understanding integration and integrative research practices in the study of human behavior, psychology, the psychological and brain sciences. So I'm working. I'm trying to kind of cash out in the sciences. You get a lot of scientists who are saying we're doing integrative work. We have integrative research programs, and they might mean they might mean interdisciplinary work where we have different folks working on from different camps working on the same problem. But they might also mean something stronger, which is that we need, you need to bring together these things, different approaches, in order to see the full story. Like they'll have this the metaphor of like the blind man and the elephant, where like we're looking around and we're getting parts of the pieces, but then it necessitates that the complexity of that which we're trying to describe. Not everything, but some things require integration. So I don't know. Did you tackle some of those kind of questions at all in your book, or sort of in terms.
To some extent, yeah. To some extent, I do in the Studying Human Behavior book, and what can I say about this? I'm not sure it's possible to say anything very general. I think one has to look kind of in making claims about integration or non-integration or elimination or non-elimination. You have to look really carefully at the kinds of data that are being brought to bear, the ways in which what measurement tools are being used, how the field of possible determinants is being specified, and how that specification of the field of possible determinants actually affects the measurement that one's going to make. So you have to look really carefully at the particular fields. I think the kind of pluralism that I advocate is kind of empirical pluralism, namely, it's quite possible that in the end it is possible. It's a single account, complex maybe, but single account may be possible. But on the other hand, maybe it is not possible, and it may be that the sort of measurement requirements of kind of different concepts make it such that you can't really create a unified story. A comprehensive story is going to be a kind of collection of disunified.
Right. Yeah. And by comprehensive, it's more just saying, here are all the pieces. And it's nothing that's going to weave together. There's not one story. It's a variety of stories. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a helpful metaphor for this, perhaps. But I guess it's a comprehensive story, I guess is the best we can say.
Yeah, sometimes I think in terms of a kaleidoscope.
Okay.
So, you have to think a little bit to figure out exactly how the kaleidoscope metaphor works. But I think it does, partly because, there's just one thing, the kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
But, with every turn, you get a different kind of set of prismatic reflections that gives you a different image. And it's still the same set of little pieces of shiny material in there, but they look differently when they're perceived differently.
Yeah. All right. So these are the three main works that you've published that have been well received in the philosophy of science literature. Is there any other a particular work that you have found has influenced the field or your way of thinking in philosophy of science?
There's some of the stuff I wrote that hasn't made its way into books, which I found that I got from thinking about the work of feminist scientists had to do with something in philosophy of science. It's called cognitive values, and I came to see that values like simplicity, explanatory power, and so forth actually constrain the kinds of explanations that we give in ways that are actually impoverishing to scientific understanding. Feminist researchers tend to pay greater attention to heterogeneity, to complexity, and I think that's partly because gender itself is heterogeneous. Mm-hmm. As a concept, it includes at least two, but also more than that once you start thinking about it. And feminists have also emphasized the ways in which processes in the natural world are not necessarily caused by some single agent, but are the outcome of complex interactions. So I think that there's probably more to be said about all that than has been said yet. I argued that the conventional values in some contexts, when used in some contexts, had problematic social consequences. But I think there's a lot more to be said. In fact, I'm really interested right now, and the papers I'm working on are trying to talk about interaction. So there's one paper that's talking about two kinds of social epistemology. One which treats sort of agents as contingently social, and another that treats interaction as a constitutive element of knowledge. That's, of course, continuous with the stuff I've been saying in those other books. But I'm also interested in thinking about social behavior as interaction, as opposed to something that is caused by features that are internal to individuals.
Yeah. So there's a movement in human behavior study that related to studying social processes as interactive. Like there's like a second person neuroscience or something. I think that's maybe what it's called. I don't know if that's similar, but I've heard folks in trying to study, at least to capture social processes. I don't know if they're thinking about it maybe quite in the strong terms as yours, but basically they're interested in order to say something meaningful about the social interaction, you have to study the interaction, is what I think they're getting at. So that's great. I'll have to I'd be happy to
look some of that up. If you want to send me some references, that'd be great.
Let me write that down. Yeah, no, I think second person neuroscience is a fascinating thing, and I know it's for folks especially who are doing just social psychologists in general, or those who might be studying social deficits such as autism spectrum disorder, or any other social cognition. Who are absolutely. I'll be certainly happy to send you some references I've come across.
Thank you.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground actually so far. Why don't we come to I guess we can catch up in terms of your scholastic career. While you're doing this work, you're teaching, you're doing work at you were at UC San Diego, Mills College for quite a while, Rice University, University of Minnesota, and now Stanford.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite university you've taught?
Oh, I shouldn't. Well,
okay. or maybe you could say one positive thing about each one.
Well, UC San Diego, actually, I learned, it was my first job. And it was, I think I wasn't ready to be a professional academic at the time.
Really?
So but
what were some signs that you felt that, you were having those kinds of thoughts?
Well, okay, so some of it is just my own personal psychological.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough.
So there was that. I mean, I just wasn't grown up enough.
Sure.
That's what I'd say.
Was it sort of like you got the job and you're like, oh, I'm actually doing this right now?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. Mills College was a great experience. It was a small college. It was a women's college. It kind of gave me space to actually grow professionally. I kind of grew out of what I could do there. But I was very grateful for the time I spent there. I had some wonderful colleagues. And it gave me my first acquaintance with Stanford. So I had friends in the Stanford philosophy department. Then they left the area, most of them, at about the same time I left the area. My partner and I wanted, for various reasons, to have different jobs, and we thought we'd come back to California in 5 years. took us 15, but we got back. Rice was, again, a small institution, very, very good students, and good colleagues. It gave me, and it was a place that really valued its faculty's research, so they were really supportive of me. I had a wonderful department, but my partner and I wanted to be in the same place, and
sure.
So she got an offer from University of Minnesota, and eventually Minnesota made me an offer as well. So we ended up there. And
wonderful. Is she in philosophy as well, or is she?
No. She's a novelist.
Oh, fantastic.
And so in creative writing.
Oh,
literary.
wow.
Yeah.
Great.
And eventually we did get back to California. So, and I'm really happy at Stanford. It's been a great experience teaching here.
Yeah, I can imagine. Is there anything? What do you like in particular about Stanford?
Well, it's got fabulous undergraduate students.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of support for research. There's lots of interesting stuff going on everywhere. In fact, too much. People are, there are a lot of really interesting colleagues all over, but especially in the sciences, there are, interesting intellectual risk takers. So it's really fun to be here.
Fantastic. Well, great. And so, in terms of current projects, it sounds like you're doing some work with social interaction stuff. Are there any other, kind of big things on the horizon?
I think that's in terms of what I know I'm doing. That's it. I keep looking for ways to collaborate intellectually with some colleagues in South Asia, in India, and it's going to be around environmental, social ecological issues, but I don't quite yet know the shape of it. So.
Okay, well, we'll be looking forward to hearing about that. Well, why don't we conclude with the final question of our interview, which will be, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Well, I don't know about challenge, but I think a task for philosophy of science that's really important is to act as a kind of interpreter of the sciences of scientific practice to a more general public. I think that skepticism about science is fed by an overly optimistic or ambitious view about what scientific research can actually provide. So when questions are raised or when there's criticism, kind of conventionally that gets represented in the media as a reason to withhold agreement or to be skeptical. And I think what we as philosophers can best do is to convey something about the way in which the methods of science themselves are methods of doubt, of questioning, of disagreement, in order to eventually arrive at a better account of the processes that we are trying to understand. So the standard of proof in science is not the same as the standard of proof in a court of law. And I think that we have a responsibility to try to convey that to the general public, so that people can kind of appreciate both the intellectual challenge and the beauty of doing science, but also understand that taking a kind of skeptical approach is not the same as rejecting science. It's more to be critically engaged with thinking about scientific ideas and the ways in which they interact with our own social projects.
Yeah, this is a tough challenge for public engagement, and it's one I think others like you and many other philosophers of science have been. Well, you mentioned maybe not a challenge, but a task. But the task is a response to saying, well, in what way maybe could philosophers of science and or scientists communicate this more nuanced view of what we as philosophers of science almost kind of take for granted about science.
Right.
The view that it's complicated, but that's okay. And in a sense, the complications are actually maybe perhaps a virtue of the way, with social knowledge, other kinds of things. I don't know. Have you had any success in encouraging this kind of view or ways in which we might be at least, find a way to welcome skepticism? We welcome skepticism, but sort of this general pronouncement for the public.
I haven't done too much public engagement work myself. I do try to convey it in my Introduction to Philosophy of Science courses. Mm-hmm. So to that extent, I hope I'm being successful, but it's hard to know.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. Oh, actually, I just had one more question there. There's actually a listener question from a fellow who was aware of this interview. Was just interested in knowing, your work with the women's liberation movement, improving the condition, improving women's studies, perhaps looking at the conditions of women in science. How do you take to be? How do you perceive the sort of the climate for women in women's studies, women in science, women in philosophy and science in general?
It's improving very slowly.
Yeah.
If you look at data on women in certain sciences, you'll see that numbers have plateaued. Biology has been more welcoming, but both physics and economics and chemistry also are areas which have been very resistant to women. And it's a really complicated question. But philosophy too has problems in attracting more women into the field. So it's something we just chip away at bit by bit.
Okay. I think that's a very honest answer. All right. Well, Helen Longino, Dr. Longino, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this afternoon. It's been wonderful hearing your story and learning how your work has grown and developed. And it sounds like there's a lot of interesting stuff to look forward to as well. So do you have anything else you'd like to leave us with or add before we go?
No, I don't think so. I've really enjoyed talking with you, Nick.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll be sure to send you those references. And best of luck for the beginning of the winter quarter. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Hal. Bye-bye.